The next lecture in the series is in memory of Maurice Dobb. Born in 1900 in London, Keynes invited Dobb to join the Political Economy Club, and after graduation, helped him secure a position at Cambridge. Dobb joined the Communist Party and in the 1930s was central to the communist movement at the university. Dobb's publications were both intellectual exchange through the introduction and defense of Marxism, as well as pieces of work that could be sold. This lecture is titled, "Is There Life on Marx? The Critique of Political Economy as a Macro-Monetary Theory of Capitalist Production," and will be delivered by Professor Riccardo Bellofiore, Professor, University of Bergamo, Italy. This lecture will be chaired by Professor Lin Chun. May I please request the speaker and the chair to come on stage. Professor Lin Chun was born in Beijing and studied and worked in the northern China before taking a scholarship to pursue a doctorate at Cambridge University. She teaches at London School of Economics and publishes in both English and Chinese. Professor, may I request you to take over the proceedings?
Okay, thank you. This is, again, the Maurice Dobb Memorial Lecture session. And I'm honored to be here to introduce our speaker. I studied at Trinity College, Cambridge University. It's on, yeah. And I remember I was very proud of being there, not because of Newton and other scientists connected with Trinity, but because of Maurice Dobb and his communist group in Cambridge. So our speaker today is Professor Riccardo Bellofiore. And he is a professor of political economy at the University of Bergamo, Italy. He teaches advanced macroeconomics, history of economic thought, and monetary economics. His research interests include capitalist contemporary economy, endogenous monetary approaches, Marxian theory, and the philosophy of economics. And the title of his lecture again today is There Life on Marx? The Critique of Political Economy as a Macro Monetary Theory of Capitalist Production. Professor.
My generation was introduced to Marx by Maurice Dobb and Paul Maurice Sweezy. We had to commit patricide, but after 50 years that I began studying economics, I think we have lost something. Very often, the Marxists and the Marxians today are insulated individuals and very idiosyncratic. Dobb and Sweezy were giants. They lived in difficult times and they had the ability to stay within the larger conversation of economics. When I was at the Rennes Library studying Sraffa's papers, I looked at the correspondence of Maurice Dobb, and there are letters with Sweezy, and I was admired by their personal exchanges and their capacity to be fair and in dialogue. There is also one theme in my discussion that has some relation to Dobb, and it is the idea that the value dimension of the capital-labor relation as a macro relation is unaffected by individual pricing, though I state this in a different way than Dobb. I will have two parts. I will be a bit more detailed on the first one, which is methodological, and I have to be quick on the second part, which will deal mainly with the arguments of Marx in the first volume of Capital. I alert you that usually my PowerPoints are a means of mass destruction. They are a lot, so I will go very quickly. You probably will see just the images, so don't worry to follow too much what is written. Yes, let us stay here. I begin with the subtitle of Das Kapital, a critique of political economy. And I'm asking why a critique? What does critique mean? Of course, here what is relevant is the distinction of Marx between vulgar political economy, which is very much the economics, neoclassical economics, and not only, which deals with superficial appearances. In German, the word is Schein, illusion. Against it, Marx puts classical political economy. Classical political economy contributed to the scientific knowledge about capital, and the main reason is that it had a labor theory of value, linking value back to labor. So it is mainly Smith and especially Marx. Classical political economy dealt with the inner reality versus the semblance, but didn't do the journey from the inner reality to the superficial reality. So it was science, but it was unfinished and limited, and it was unfinished and limited because it was bourgeois. So Marx thought that science had to be developed. Political economy had to become critical political economy. Now, political economy deals, and in a sense also critical political economy, with how capital produces. Capital is something given. The point is for Marx to go back to the question of how capital is produced. Capital is also something that must be constituted. It is a system, a totality. Marx gives a circular explanation of this totality, in a sense capital producing capital, and this is the Hegelian moment of exposition, Darstellung. But for Marx there is at the same time a movement of expression from the inner to the outer. From this point of view, the Darstellung, the exposition, is also the point about, it has to be related to the point of how the inner manifests itself in the phenomenon. And this is the moment not of illusion, but of Erscheinung, the phenomenical manifestation. Critique here means at least two things. First, what are the conditions of possibility of this science, classical political economy? It is a sort of Kantian moment. And Marx, however, is not a Kantian. These conditions of possibility are historical. When it goes this way, he goes on saying that actually we have to criticize the science itself. And criticizing the science itself, we are criticizing capital. We must be aware that critique is not criticism. Criticism is pointing out of the errors. Let us say pointing out the errors of vulgar political economy. But critique is something else. It is revealing the inner truth of what is criticized, and at the same time the limitation and going beyond the movement of Aufheben. Well, what is missing in classical political economy? We know it is the duality of labor, which is concrete and abstract. It is the analysis of the form of value, labor contained but not money. It is the distinction between labor power and living labor, which is missing in political economy. But very often Marxists miss a most fundamental point in my interpretation, that labor power and living labor are connected, are attached to the workers as human living labor power. So we have a third dimension, which is the living labor power, the workers. The Hegelian moment may be represented by this, Marx inverting Hegel. Here the point that I want to make is to make another distinction which is not always understood, the distinction between the fetish character of value, money, and capital, and fetishism. The fetish character means that things in capitalism, really, it is not an illusion, really are endowed of social properties. What is fetishism? Fetishism is to attribute these social properties of things to things as natural objects. So fetishism is naturalizing the social properties. Part of Marx's analysis is dedicated to fetish character and fetishism. But his last question is, how is the fetish and capital as a fetish constituted? How capital, which is a thing, an automatic fetish, a subject in German, how this as a social relation is constituted. I have not time to go into this in detail. I just want you to understand that from this point of view, dialectics is in German a Methode auf Widerruf, a method on recall. It has no universal validity. It is only valid under the capitalist relations. So let us go to the book, Capital. I find this cartoon pretty much getting the thing. You see Mao saying Marx, yes, I've read your book. Marx's answer is, really? How did it end? I will go very quickly, because I imagine that all of you have read Capital, and especially the first book, through some important points, stressing the difference in my interpretation from the usual ones. The chapters 1, 3, the most difficult in Capital. The commodity has an inner duality, which we realize is the duality of use value and value. Use value is produced by concrete labor. It is only the concrete labor which is embodied in the product. Value is produced by abstract labor. Abstract labor is not embodied in the product. It is contained in the product. When we analyze a single commodity, Marx is saying, though this surprised most of Marxists, that this value is immaterial. It is a ghost. At this point, Marx starts a ghost story, a Gothic ghost story. The ghost must take possession of a body to actually come into being. Does it succeed? Yes. In Marx chapters 1, 3, there is an embodiment of value into money, money as a commodity, gold as a commodity. Money is value embodied. So you don't have abstract labor as labor embodied, but you have money as value embodied. In the first edition of Capital, first chapter, Marx says it is as if, besides lions, tigers, hares, and all other real animals, also the animal existed, the individual incarnation of the whole animal kingdom. This is Hegel. I don't know if it is the true Hegel. Hegelian says that Hegel was never so idealistically crazy. Marx thought that he was idealistically crazy and thought that that's why it was useful to analyze this crazy reality, which is capitalism. Now, another important point, which is missed by most economic theories of Marx in the first 3 chapters, is that his value theory is at the same moment a monetary theory. Warenaustausch, that is commodity exchange, is essentially monetary. This is a point of the Neue Marx literature from Reichelt and Backhaus to Heinrich today, but it is also a possible point of contact with the Keynesians, and especially of the Dudley-Diller variety. Look at the word incarnation. Marx makes a lot about incarnation. So he was not only a ghost Gothic novelist, he was also a theologian. This incarnation is a transubstantiation. Use value is the human being, value is the Holy Ghost, money is Jesus. Now, this analysis is great from many points of view. It is a movement of expression from the inner to the outer, because Marx says when commodities are produced, they have a price tag attached on them. This price tag is an expected quantity of gold. But the value of money, of gold as money, is given. Why is given? Marx's answer is from an originary barter, Produktenaustausch. This barter gives this value. When you have this value, you after production, you have already a labor quantity which has to be actualized in exchange. Now, I say this is a great theory. It is the beginning for Marx of a monetary labor theory of value. For me, it is problematic. I don't buy the argument of monetary exchange based on a barter moment. So this is a problem, and this problem was realized in many countries differently during the 70s. Marx is coherent only within money as a commodity approach, but when we move to capital in the monetary economy, money cannot be a commodity. If money is a commodity, commodities have to be produced, but capitalist production requires finance to production. And then also gold as commodity would require a finance to production. We are in a vicious circle, which was revealed by the Italian economist Augusto Graziani. Is there a way out from these difficulties? We will see. In chapters 4-6, I am following the confusing English edition by Engels of the translation of Capital, edited by Engels. In chapter 4-6, we have that Marx, the Gothic novelist, the theologian, becomes an entomologist. His question becomes how money as money, value embodied, become money as capital, money begetting money. Money as money is the chrysalis. Money as capital is a butterfly, a very nice thing. How this happens? In chapter 4, Marx says, capital is an over-grasping, dominating subject. Capital produces all the moments of reality. It is what Hegelians calls, and rightly so, positing. This is a positing of the presuppositions. But Marx, in chapter 7, breaks with Hegel. His transition from money as money to money as capital, in my interpretation, is not a dialectical deduction. It's a non-Hegelian constitution, because the constitution has to do with class struggle in production. Marx has what I would call, following Rubin but with a different train of thought, a method of comparison. He makes a reasoning in 2 steps. In the first step, living labor extracted from the living labor bearers, living labor power bearers, who are human beings, by capital. This living labor is equal to necessary labor. Then prices are values. But then there will be no profit. So Marx says capitalists are angry, but in fact the capitalists knew already from the beginning that they could extract more living labor from the labor power bearers than necessary labor. But here capital means a specific, determinate social problem. As Magna Desai rightly said yesterday, for Marx, in exchange on the labor market, there is an equality of the subject through law. So for the first time, capital has to extract labor from labor power bearers who are free subjects. So this is a forced labor that must be imposed to free and equal human beings. So what happens is problematic. It depends on what it happens in the production process. From this point of view, let me stress, this is a point that I have in common with an Italian philosopher now teaching in the US, Massimiliano Tomba. Exploitation must not be seen just as surplus labor. That's an important but derivative meaning. The fundamental meaning of exploitation for Marx is the consumption of workers' bodies and minds as human beings. So exploitation affects the whole time of workers. Exploitation has to do also with the quality of labor. In my view, this is the ground of the labor theory value. Marxist does not question why value comes only from labor. This is the answer, because this is the specific difficulty of capital, which owns everything, as to extract from workers the living labor. So from this point of view, the new value added in the period, the monetary value added, is nothing but the monetary expression of direct labor. Direct labor is the dead objectification of living labor within the period. So what was the butterfly? The butterfly was in fact a vampire. The chrysalis becomes a butterfly only when capital as dead labor, vampire-like, sucks living labor. It is not absorbs. It's in German, it sucks living labor. And capital lives the more labor it sucks. So here you have the ghost, the chrysalis, the butterfly, but then the vampire. There is a wonderful quote, I have no time to read it, from chapter 7, in which what I say is expressed. And by the way, in every language that I've seen, there is an error of translation. Living labor power is translated always as either living labor or labor power. This quote is interesting for another point that was raised by Magna Desai, the literary quality. Here, Marx says that capital, this subject which seems automatic, perform its own valorization process, becomes an animated monster which begins to work as if its body were by love possessed. This is a quote from Goethe. And at first, for years, I thought, oh, what a poetic image. No. That's a rat who is dying from poisoning. So all these metaphors, Gothic, etc., are not metaphors. They have scientific value. And here we have the rat. Let me go now after chapter 7. If I would have the time, I would explain this, but I would not do that. It is an elaboration of something I saw in a French book. Now let me be very quick on other few key points of volume 1. Chapters 10, 12, extraction of absolute surplus value, extraction of relative surplus value. I say nothing about this. I just say that in Marx there is not a theory of absolute immiseration of the working class. This was rightly contested in the 60s and 70s now, because actually capital is really immiserating people. It came back with a vengeance. But in Marx there is no absolute immiseration of the working class. There is rather what Rosa Luxemburg wrote in the introduction to political economy in the chapter on wage. There is a law of the tendential fall of the relative wage. with the fall of the relative wage, you can have higher real wage, even shorter hours, and a lower share of the value of labor power for workers, but you have the capital winning. And I think that if you distinguish between productive and unproductive workers, this has not been disproved by history. In chapter 12, there is another of the great points of Marx. Marx, who at first wanted to skip away from competition in the first book of Capital, he realized that to understand how capital obtains relative surplus value, this macro result, he must go into a micro-founded argument. He must go and look at the individual behavior of individual firms within the sector. So Marx, in chapter 12, introduces the hunt for extra surplus value, which, if you wish, it is an out of equilibrium movement. This notion of competition is radically different than the usual Ricardian competition, or than the usual Varrasian or even Marshallian competition. So Marx has a dual notion of competition. This notion of competition is now well known to economists under another name, Joseph Alois Schumpeter. But Schumpeter very well knew his debt to Marx. In the introduction to the Japanese edition, he wrote, hired two masters, Barras for the circularity of the capitalist process in exchange, but this is without introducing capital. But then the competition, the so-called dynamic competition. So, look at the last point. In my view, the value dynamics, which is class struggle in production, chapter 7, innovation and cutthroat competition, chapter 12, are they that determines the methods of production. This actually dissolves the so-called transformation problem, because when you say that all the new value produced is coming from living labor, prices, whatever they are, can only distribute this direct labor, the objectification of living labor. And the methods of production, from which Sraffa starts, are actually constructed by the competition among capital in Schumpeter's, that is, in Marx's meanings. So that's why the labor theory of value is essential. Let me go to chapter 25, section 7, the section on reproduction. It is the point about the Industrial Reserve Army. The Industrial Reserve Army, this chapter, 25th, has been interpreted as a theory of the cycle because of the Industrial Reserve Army. Accumulation, exhaustion of the Industrial Reserve Army, wages goes up, there are innovations, capital composition goes up, there is a replenishment of the Industrial Reserve Army at this point, and wages that before went up now go down. In the late 60s and early 70s, it has been interpreted as a theory of crisis due to profit squeeze in distribution. Again, as I worked on this cyclical view, and they are wonderful papers and interesting literature, but I think that chapter 25 of Marx dealt with another problem. Chapter 25 was the alternative of Marx to Malthus' law of population. How capital gets the working population it needs. Not from the vagaries of democracy, but immanently to an immanent process. So it is a position of the presupposition. But if you put into the argument the fact that living labor comes from the living bearers of labor power, you have that the fact that Marx stresses in this quote that capital works on both sides at the same time, supply and demand, in some specific historical situation could be reversed. So in my view, in the late 60s and early 70s, you have to consider that I lived in Turin, the Turin of the class struggle at Fiat at the time. Well, in those periods, it was possible to constrain capital's ability to extract living labor from workers. In that phase, the crisis of capital was a social crisis in valorization, in the direct process, in the immediate process of valorization. So what happened then was, yes, a profit squeeze, but not mainly a profit squeeze in distribution, but a profit squeeze coming from the value producing production. So Marx was absolutely right to say that, to put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is independent, not the dependent variable. The rate of wages is the dependent, not the independent variable. When this breaks, when this does not work anymore, when the fall of the relative wage is interrupted, are we in a conflictualist reality where everything is possible? No, because as again Rosa Luxemburg said in the chapter on wage, this poses a problem of political exit. This is a break of capital as a relation. In this section 7, but actually in chapter 23, there is another very, very important moment in my interpretation. And it has to do with this quote that you find here. Marx says in chapter 23 that capitalists advance money drafts to workers who gave them back to get then lot of the product. In the results, that is in the chapter 6 unpublished, the argument was more refined. Marx says it is not the workers that buy the means of subsistence, but the means of subsistence that buy the worker as living labor power. In this argument, the composition of output is given and the real wage is given, but not the individual real wage. The real wage of the working class, according to the choices of capitalists on the composition of output. Well, if you give this to read to a Kaleskian, he immediately understands what we are talking about. Marxists do not. If you give this to people like Kaldor or John Robinson, they immediately understand. And this has exactly to do with the rate of accumulation being the independent variable, with investments being the driver of the process. Again, Rosa Luxemburg was right. In this reality, it is demand which drives production, but it is accumulation driven by demand that drives distribution. In this argument, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. If you read that chapter, you see something which is foreign to contemporary Marxists, and Marxists probably ever, that what Marx is saying is that the macro logic, of course he didn't use the term macro, he used the term totality, capital as a whole, the working class. The macro logic is unique, is not the sum of the parts, but it's also opposite to the micro logic. After having said that the exchange between workers and capitalists is an exchange between free subjects, he says the opposite. From the macro point of view, workers are slaves of capital as a whole. The working class has no choice. What was presented as phenomenal manifestation is revealed to be an illusory semblance, but after Marx is difficult to read because the meaning of the categories changes along the way. I have no time to go back to section 6 on the wage, but there is one point again which is missed by contemporary Marxists. They follow these ruffians in talking of the wage just as a share. But in chapter 6, you realize that actually the workers may have the same wage, but more labor could be made liquid from the living labor powers. So even if we started from a position in which the wage was paid as the value of labor power, at this point the price of labor power diverges and the price of labor power goes below, and this could go on for a while, you know, unless there is a reaction. I already dissolved the transformation problem, so I go into other details. Marxists and Marxians have a transformation problem, but it's another one, the problem of transform socially the reality. There is a point, however, from the third volume that I want to stress. In chapter 10 of the third volume, Marx introduces the notion of ordinary demand. This has to do with the notion of socially necessary labor time. Marx gives two definitions. First, the socially necessary labor time according to the average technique. Second, and it is already in the first chapter, socially necessary labor is the labor satisfying the social need. So, in a sense, demand is there. But if you ask what is average technique for Marx, you see that the average techniques within the industry is not defined independently, not only from dynamic competition, but also from demand. According, there is more or less, the less efficient or the more efficient of capitals could be relevant for the socially necessary labor time. Okay, what about chapter 10 in the volume 3? In chapter 10 of the volume 3, Marx introduces this notion of ordinary demand, where he says that capitals produce for ordinary demand. As I interpret it, it has the same meaning as Keynes' hypothesis in the first model of expectations that the short-term expectations of firms are fully realized. This means that the abstract labor was not immediately private labor, is always confirmed in the market. This has nothing to do, of course, with full employment, absence of crisis from demand, etc. So, my argument is that in the first volume of Capital, Marx is determining, actually, from class struggle, the total living labor which is extracted from workers, and the necessary labor which has to be given back to workers. These are accounted as labor-contained magnitude. The individual pricing changes the presentation as an illusion of this, but the rate of exploitation remains unaffected, even though the rate of the profit bill and the wage bill translated in labor commanded may be different. I should go into crisis theory, but I have not the time to go into crisis theory. I just close going back to the very beautiful, I enjoyed it very much, talk of this morning on a neoclassical reading Marx. The title of my talk is There Life on Marx? If I understood well, the answer was yes, it was discussed 50 years ago, but the real answer today is no. There is no more life on Marx. My answer to is there life in Marx is why not?
Microphone. Okay, now, okay. Thank you very much, Professor, for a great lecture. That was a very close reading of Marx. We have only 5 minutes remaining, so maybe just 2 questions. We'll pick up. Okay.
You see, when the notion of critique comes, it's an immanent critique of classical political economy. Being an immanent critique, it means that whatever classical economics did has to be taken for granted. And so the price of labor power as a commodity has to be the labor cost of producing labor power. And there's no scope for asking for higher wages or anything like that. That's the rule of the game. You have to accept Riccardo's proposition that population growth will regulate the real wage. You have to accept the profit rates would be equalized. Given those difficulties, Marx had to extract profit as due to surplus value. And that, I think, is a great achievement. Following the rules of the enemy, as it were, he finds the answer to defeat them. And that, I think, is a great achievement.
Okay, thank you. Can we take another question? This man over there.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. I want to, you pointed out that dialectics is the dialectics of the society itself. That dialectics is the dialectic in society itself in the present moment. That it's a question of, if you will, philosophy being worldly in the world. And in that context, I wonder if the bourgeois political economists really are rightly considered to be the enemy, but rather to be radical figures of emancipation in their time, that Marx would consider Adam Smith, for instance, to be a revolutionary intellectual no less than himself, and that his object is not the same object as capital. And so in that context, I wonder if the question of fetishism is really the question that arises for Marx in a way that in other words, the whole question of the way in which the essence appears or manifests phenomenologically is a fundamentally different question in the 19th century in a context of industrial revolution. Which to me gets to something that Dr. Mishra mentioned yesterday, which is democracy as the political expression of capitalist society. In other words, the way in which the questions of fetishism and the fetish character in capital are really getting at questions of the self-contradictions of democratic attempts to emancipate the working class.
Okay.
So in other words, capital as written in the wake of the 18th Brumaire.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Yes, to the question by the side. My answer is yes and no. Yes, the price of labor power, the value of labor power is what it is. Marx imagines 1/3 of the book that wages are paid according to the price of labor, to the value of labor power. There are these changes of price. I doubt that this can be taken as given literally. That is, Marx does not do a moral criticism of capitalism. Its point is that you don't go beyond capitalism just rising wages, but exactly like the working day, the length of the working day in chapter 10, in English it's, I don't know, should be 10, but I'm not sure, is a result of class struggle. So is the wage. You have wage prices and profit, I think it's, so there is room for change. Let me quote again Rosa Luxemburg. You may think I am a Rosa Luxemburg fan. You are right. I am a Rosa Luxemburg fan. My dissertation was on Rosa Luxemburg. She wrote, I think, at the time of the critique of Bernstein, that the trade unions are there exactly to avoid that the price of labor power is too low and to realize the value of labor power, that is, to realize the labor theory of value. Otherwise, capital would eat the workers, and then this is a nice collapse theory. At the same time, in 1905, she gave a more political role to trade unions. So there was a shift. It became the locus of struggle, but again, to overcome capitalism, not to realize higher wages. I am nothing against struggles for higher real wages, but the point of Marx is another one. The same answer, yes and no, is to the second question. First, why classical political economy is bourgeois? I don't go to explain why vulgar political economy is bourgeois. And why they were not able to answer their own problems. Because if you realize the distinction between labor power and living labor, and the fact that they are attached to human beings as the living bearers of labor power, well, you are putting into question the present social order. The same can be said about form of value, money. The same can be said about not having a crisis theory, etc. This does not mean that they are the enemy, because they were quite right in understanding that reality. And that reality is progressive relatively to the past. The free and human social beings didn't exist before. As the socialized labor in production, which is the reality of capitalism when there is the real subsumption of labor to capital, machine of factor, didn't exist before. So democracy is the point from which you have to struggle. You have to defend it, you have to create it where it is attacked, but it is from where, and again, I can give you a quote from Rosa Luxemburg, but I don't want to annoy you. Marx was very hard against vulgar economists, but he studied them seriously. You know, take Samuel Bailey, take Malthus, he insults Malthus, but he always took him seriously. About the fetishism, probably I was not clear, but you use fetishism for what I use fetish character. Fetishism is attributing the social properties of the fetish to nature. I think you were referring to the other thing. So, yes, I agree with you. Marx's point is not the criticism of fetishism. Is the critique of the fetish character, how the fetish is constituted, how you can overthrow this reality and have a positive social transformation. And to do that, you can go backwards. You must start from democracy and all that. But let me not stop here, because we are living in a specific social reality in which capitalism is destroying these bases. So, for example, when Marx talked about also the socialization of workers, immediate socialization of workers in production, Marx's idea was that capital put workers together, shaped the labor process, a lot of awful things, but capital had to put together workers. So this was the basis of conflict. Now, put yourself in the world of Deliveroo, of Uber, etc. Capital technologically may connect workers for the valorization process without putting them together. So the basis for Marx of overcoming capitalism is put at risk. Is this the end of the story? Let me quote a Bolshevik newspaper with a Luxembourgian journalist. The Bolshevik newspaper is Financial Times. The Luxembourgian journalist is Sarah O'Connor. In late 2016, and I close here, she wrote a wonderful article, When Your Boss is an Algorithm. And was talking of Deliveroo and was talking about Uber. The Uber workers, how could fight capital? They turned the strikers at Uber, they turned into consumers, asked for a a service from Uber, so other Uber workers had to go to them, and the struggle was generalized, and it arrived exactly in trials, in the laws, etc. So I'm not saying that this is the solution. I am saying that capital is open-ended exactly because it is the consumption of workers, but workers as living labor power in relation, they can fight back, and they can construct a reality beyond the realm of economic, because Marx was not a productivist at all.
Thank you. Time is up, but I have to say this. I forgot to mention Professor Bellofiore's many publications. The most recent ones are listed in our booklet, so you can take a look. Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Bellofiore and Professor Lin. I request Dr. Sunita Lal to present the mementos to our speaker and our chair.